Caring for Kids God's Way, a biblical counseling certificate program in child advocacy developed by the American Association of Christian Counselors through Light University. Your ministry is to be a Galatians 6:2 helper. Ours is to equip you with the highest level of advanced training from the world's leading Christian counselors. 24 experts teaming up to create the most comprehensive child studies curriculum for the personal classroom. May the Lord bless your study as you begin caring for kids God's way. A partner in the Lyles and Crawford Clinical Consulting Practice, psychologist for Westminster Schools in Atlanta, former director of a Rafa Inpatient Unit for Children and Adolescents, and author of the book, The Obsessive-Compulsive Trap. Here's Dr. Mark Crawford, Parenting with Love and Grace.
Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Crawford. If you work with teenagers, and especially if you're a parent of a teenager, I'm not going to have to convince you very much that there are some tricky issues that come up during this time of life. The roughly 6 years we know as adolescence is really a time of transition, not just for kids, but also for parents. The transition for kids is going from child to adult, but there's also a major transition occurring for parents during this time. Their role as a parent is transitioning as well, from more of a management role to a more of a consultant role. And these two kinds of transitions can really turn into some tricky issues in families that have teenagers. Now, I've spent over 16 years working directly with teenagers and their families, and I've seen these power struggles get families into some real trouble. In fact, I've seen families really shut down or locked down over some fairly minor issues, and I've seen some families struggle with some very serious issues during this time. Today, what I would like to do is give you some idea of what I see as the process of transition that goes along with this period of adolescence, and to give you some specific tools that can help you in helping these families get through this time and this transition a little bit more smoothly. Now, at some point today, I want to give you what I consider the 3 non-negotiable rules that all families with teenagers should have. I believe that there really only need to be 3 non-negotiable rules, and it's going to be a lot easier to enforce 3 main rules than 300 rules, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. Second, I want to talk to you about the 2 tools that every parent has at his or her disposal. And these tools have very different outcomes and need to be used differently. And one of the things that I see in families with teenagers is that if these tools are used in the wrong domains, it can really get families in trouble. Near the end today, I want to talk to you about some of the most common pitfalls or difficult issues that I see going along with this time of adolescence, and give you some specific steps to help these families become unstuck. Now, first, I'd like to begin with Stephen Covey's idea of beginning with the end in mind. I think when I work with families with teenagers, I almost always start by asking them to list very specifically, what do you see as a successful outcome for your child once he or she becomes an adult? In other words, list some specific characteristics that you would like to see your child display or having as an adult, and that will help guide this process along more smoothly. In other words, without a clear destination, it's going to be difficult to develop a good roadmap. Now, this oftentimes exposes what parents believe to be the most important part of their job as a parent. If you work with families with teenagers, you'll probably find that most of your discussions with teenagers and their families have to do with decisions. For example, parents and teenagers will argue and fight about decisions around curfew or grades or friends or things of that nature. And what we find is that those decisions are what get people locked into power struggles. What most parents don't realize is that behind every decision is a belief that they have about what's important for their child. And if we can get parents to really expose those beliefs or to at least understand them, then the decision-making process becomes a lot easier. What I want to do is give you some ideas that I have come up with about what a healthy, independent adult looks like, because one of the things that I think all parents will agree on is that the main goal of parenting is to raise a child to become a healthy, independent adult. And most of the decisions that they make, if they're based on that belief, will really help them avoid some of the major power struggles. You're going to see a slide, and what I want to do is I want to illustrate for you just some characteristics that I have come up with in working with families on what makes up a healthy, independent adult. In other words, if you think about some healthy and independent adults that you know, it's likely that you'll see some of these qualities or characteristics. The first one is that they all have a clear sense of right and wrong. In other words, they have an internal moral compass that helps them to know, in this situation, there is a right and wrong, and I need to know what it is. The second characteristic is that they experience appropriate levels of pride for making good decisions and appropriate levels of guilt for making bad decisions. In other words, I italicize the word appropriate because it can be extreme on either end. We think a healthy adult neither gloats in their accomplishments or achievements, nor do they just ruminate and feel neurotically guilty when they make mistakes or bad choices, but they do experience appropriate levels of both of these emotions. The third characteristic is that they are aware of their strengths and weaknesses and embrace and accept both as part of who they are. This is an important one because in the culture that I think we live in, a lot of parents are reading a lot of material about self-esteem, and there's really a self-esteem worship kind of phenomenon we see going on where a lot of times parents are told if your kids feel good about themselves, then they can accomplish anything and everything will be okay. Well, the research on that simply doesn't hold up. In other words, self-esteem does not really predict success, it actually follows success. And in fact, some kids with very high levels of self-esteem at times don't show great character. So self-esteem alone isn't really sufficient. So what we find is that healthy kids and healthy teenagers, and especially healthy adults, really are aware that there are some things that they're very good at and that they're strong in, and there are some things that they are simply not so good at, but that's okay. In other words, they embrace the idea that God gave them certain gifts and that some of their weaknesses are simply part of their makeup, but they're okay with that. They can accept that as part of who they are. The fourth characteristic is that healthy adults are secure and confident in their identity, but do not believe that the world revolves around them. Again, this goes into the self-esteem idea a little bit. They do feel good about who they are, but they don't have a sense of entitlement that sort of conveys the idea that the world revolves around them. In other words, they're not narcissistic. The next characteristic of a healthy adult is that they're able to say no and hear no when it's necessary. In other words, if they're in a situation that involves some negative peer pressure, they're able to say no and stand up for themselves. And when necessary, they can hear no and handle it appropriately. Next, healthy adults understand that responsibilities are important and they do not depend heavily on motivation to fulfill them. We'll talk about this in more detail later, but essentially what this means is that all healthy adults understand that there are responsibilities that they must fulfill, but they really don't depend on being motivated in order to get them done. The reason for this is that motivation is very undependable. If you rely on motivation, your performance is generally inconsistent. And again, we'll talk more about this a little bit later. The next characteristic is that healthy adults treat others with dignity and respect, even when others can't do anything for them. What we find oftentimes is that some people really only treat others well when they get something out of it. But a healthy adult is respectful of other people regardless of what that person can do for them. Next, a healthy adult can handle disappointment and adversity without becoming explosive or paralyzed. Handling disappointment and adversity, I think, is one of the major characteristics of a healthy individual, and this is something that we want to work with teens on to develop that skill. Next, a healthy adult's identity is not based solely upon their achievements. Again, this is where we want to get away from overemphasizing achievements, which we'll talk about later, but help kids become adults whose identity is solid, independent of their achievements or accomplishments. And the final characteristic that I have here is that healthy adults are able to tolerate frustration in the pursuit of a goal or the development of a new skill. By the time folks get to be my age, there are not a lot of new skills that we develop. Most of the things we do, we've practiced for a long time. Recently, I was taking some guitar lessons with my son, which is a very new skill for me, and it became clear that in learning a new skill, you have to tolerate a great deal of frustration. Things don't come easily. So it's important for teenagers to learn that to be a healthy adult, you have to tolerate some level of frustration in the pursuit of a goal. Now, obviously, this list is not exhaustive or inclusive. What I would encourage you to do when you're working with families or in your own family is to make a list of what you believe to be the characteristics of a healthy adult that you would like to see in your teenager once they become an adult. And this again will help guide your decision making as you go along the process of adolescence. The next diagram that you're going to see is what I refer to as the 3 R's. Now this is where I condense most of the major rules of parenting into 3 non-negotiable rules. In other words, for a teenager to grow up in an environment where there is safety, security, appropriate boundaries, and you can develop those skills of becoming a healthy adult, I think there are 3 non-negotiable rules or boundaries that really must be in place. And if you look at the diagram, all of these rules start with the letter R. And the 3 R's include respect, responsibility, and risk. And let me define those a little more clearly. Respect really refers to how you treat parents and siblings within your family. It's not only an attitude, but it's also a set of behaviors. In other words, respect means that you treat other people in your family with courtesy and cordiality. It doesn't mean that when parents walk into the room, a teenager stands at attention and salutes, but it does mean that there is an element of cordiality and courtesy at all times, and that's an attitude of respect. The second R refers to responsibility. Now, responsibility for a teenager really involves 2 domains: household chores and school. These are the main responsibilities of adolescence. And what we refer to here with responsibility is that a teenager needs to go to school and put in reasonable effort and also complete a certain amount of household chores at home. And these should be done without excessive coercion or staying on them all the time. But they're showing appropriate levels of responsibility. And the last one is risk. Risk really refers to avoiding behaviors that are dangerous or potentially harmful. And that includes things obviously like drugs and alcohol and irresponsible driving and things of that nature. Now, one of the reasons that I think this model is helpful is because it condenses the major rules that I believe are important for safety and for having an environment in a family within which you can negotiate these other things. It creates an environment that is not impossible to enforce. A lot of families find that if they can condense these rules to the 3 R's, a lot of their power struggles go away. It's much easier to focus on 3 main rules than it is to focus on 30 or even 300 rules. And in a lot of families I've seen, that's really what goes on. They have a rule for everything. And it really gets unwieldy and almost impossible to enforce 1,000 different rules because you're always in the management role. Now, in my experience, when I've presented this model of the 3 R's to teenagers, without exception, most teenagers will tell me that seems fair and reasonable. And so you're at an advantage in working with families if you can find a teenager who will say, you know, I understand why those rules are important, and I understand that you will be enforcing those. And so again, it eliminates a lot of the unessential power struggles. Let me give you an example of how this comes into play. And I'm going to use an example from my own life. Recently, my son was coming out when we were getting ready to go somewhere, and he had on a pair of shorts that had holes in it and was a little bit ratty. And I said, you know, you need to go change your shorts. Well, he didn't want to change his shorts, and he thought, I don't know why I need to change them. These seem to be fine, and I really like them. And so that, to me, signaled a challenge. And what I felt like doing was putting my foot down and saying, well, you're going to change your clothes, and that's the way it is. And my wife wisely pulled me aside and said, you know, is it really that important for him to wear a different pair of shorts versus this pair of shorts for where we're going? And fortunately, I listened to her, and she was right. It absolutely was not important. It certainly did not involve a responsibility issue. I mean, we were going to go out and have fun. He was not being disrespectful. He just said, you know, I really would like to wear these shorts. And was this an issue of risk? Absolutely not. I mean, there's nothing involving safety. So I went back and said, you know, I think you're right. I don't really see a reason. I would prefer that you wear the other pair, but you know what? It's your call, and it's not going to be a big deal. And obviously it wasn't. Now, I could have easily engaged in a real power struggle over that, and we could have gotten angry at one another, and it would have really been a mess. But because it did not fall into this category of non-negotiable rules, we were able to avoid a power struggle over something that really did not need to be a power struggle at all. And that, to me, is one of the helpful things of having this model of the 3 R's. Now, at this point, I would like to talk a little bit about what happens during that period of transition from childhood to adulthood known as adolescence. The diagram you're going to see shows that in adolescence there are two different domains that emerge, meaning there's a separation between what I call behavior and identity. Now for me it's helpful to put those three R's under the category of behavior. In other words, risk, responsibility, and respect really are observable behaviors. Identity refers to things like belief systems, opinions, and values. In other words, things that are very changeable during the time of adolescence. Every parent of a teenager can attest to this. What a teenager sees as important one day will be unimportant the next day, and vice versa. Their value system is evolving, their belief system is changing, and their opinions fluctuate as often as the weather. So identity is sort of separating out, and they're becoming their own person, which very often means they're breaking away from their parents' ideas, beliefs, and opinions. And this is natural and this is healthy in order for them to form their own opinion. Now, because of this separation of domains, it's very important to understand that every parent has at his or her disposal two tools that they use in their role as parent. The next diagram that you're going to see explains these tools and talks about the outcome of each. The two tools also start with the letter R just to keep things consistent. The first tool is the tool of rank, and the second is the tool of relationship. But let me explain this a little bit further. Rank refers to the position of authority that a parent has in the life of a teenager. In other words, God has put a parent in the life of a child to act as an authority figure. And that's healthy, that's necessary, and that's one of their tools. But the second tool, relationship, is a little bit different. Relationship refers to the quality of connection that a parent has with that teenager. And the outcome of that tool is really influence, rather than the outcome of control, which is the outcome of the tool of rank. So let me clarify this. The position of authority that a parent occupies in the life of a teenager is their rank. And rank is really used to do one thing. It's used to control, to set limits, to enforce boundaries. The second tool is the tool of relationship, and that tool is used to influence. In other words, a teenager is likely to heed the advice of a parent because of the quality of relationship. Now, I'm going to tell you how these tools are used in the different domains in a moment, but I want to talk to you a little bit about establishing these tools. And what I find oftentimes is that a parent who's really good at one of those tools may not be quite as good at the other. In other words, let's say, for example, a father who's a successful businessman or who runs a company is going to be pretty good at rank. They're pretty used to being in that position. And yet they may be not quite as good at establishing relationship with their teenager. This is not always true, but it oftentimes is the case. On the other hand, a parent who's really good at establishing and maintaining a relationship with their teenager may have a little trouble getting into that role of being in charge or pulling rank, if you will. So let me talk a little bit about how to make sure you're able to use these tools effectively. The next slide talks a little bit about establishing rank. In order to be effective in using that tool, first you need to understand the importance of limits. All kids need limits. It's very clear. We know that. I shouldn't need to belabor that point. Limits are there for safety, to create a sense of security. And again, limits really refers to what we talked about earlier as the 3 R's. Those are important. Without those, teenagers can really get in trouble. The second thing is to use the tool of rank effectively. It's important to be clear about who's in charge in your home. Now, some parents are uncomfortable with that, and sometimes parents can overdo this, but in all families, there really does need to be a clear understanding that when it comes down to it, the parents have the final say. In other words, the parent is in charge, the parent is the authority figure, and ultimately, they need to be comfortable in that role. In order to be able to use this tool, it's important not to be afraid for your kids to be angry with you. In fact, I tell parents of teenagers all the time, if your kids don't get angry with you occasionally, you're probably missing something, because to set those limits, kids are just going to be upset with you from time to time. Remember that your kids have plenty of friends, but they only have 2 parents. They need you to be a parent more than they need you to be a friend. And finally, you don't have to have limits that you don't intend to enforce. Once again, this is why I think it's important to condense your non-negotiable rules down to 3. Those limits are always going to be enforced. If you have those, you need to enforce them. Don't set up a rule or a boundary that you don't intend to enforce, because what that does is it undermines your role as an authority figure, and it makes your tool of rank less effective. Continuing along on the next diagram, it's important to follow through. In other words, you must be consistent when you have a boundary that you say is important. Next, it's important to be as consistent as possible, meaning don't enforce a rule one day and not enforce it another day. Expect your rank to be challenged and stay calm. It's really the job of a teenager to test the waters a little bit and find out where the limits are. This is really not dangerous, and it's really not a crisis or an emergency. That's really just what all teenagers do. They're going to go up against the limit and push on it a little bit. That's fine. Just stay calm and make sure you're comfortable there. And finally, it's important to have confidence in your instincts. I tell parents you don't have to be Solomon to be a good parent. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to make some bad decisions. That's just part of being human. But you need to be comfortable in making decisions when it's time to be in the role of rank. Now, establishing a relationship is a whole different ballgame. And in the next diagram, I'm going to give you some ideas about how to effectively establish a relationship with your teen that allows you influence in their life. The first is really the most important, and that is spending time with your teenager. There just simply is no substitute. Without time, there can be no relationship. To have a relationship with a teen, you need to make sure you're spending time. Now, I know that most parents of teens tell me, well, my teen doesn't really want to make time to spend with me. I'm not they're on the top of their list of fun people to be with. And when I talk to teens alone, what they tell me is they really want their parents to make that time and to insist upon that time. Don't look for your teenager to come and ask you to spend time with them. That rarely happens. If it does, consider yourself lucky. But you as the parent should really seek them out and should really carve out that time and say, this is our time together. You know, I know it's important for you to be with your friends, but we need to do this. And it's better to make it a fun time. You know, whether you spend an hour or two at Starbucks or go to lunch at one of their favorite places or do something that they enjoy doing. But the main thing is just spending time together, because relationship forms out of time. The next thing, and this is very, very important, in order to have a relationship with your teenager, you have to let them have a separate identity. In other words, you need to let them be different than you, and you need to let them be different than what you might expect them to be like. I know as a parent, and talking with many, many parents over the years, every parent has sort of an idea of what they would like for their kids to act like, look like. We have ideas of what we hope they'll believe to be important. And almost without exception, kids are going to choose certain paths that just didn't fit our agenda for them. In other words, if we wanted them to be a star football player, they may prefer to be a musician. If we wanted our kids to be a Republican, they may choose to be a Democrat. But it's important to allow them to develop a separate identity, because if they feel like you are forcing them to become someone they don't want to be, they're going to resist a relationship with you. Next, it's important to learn to listen. Parents often have a habit, myself included, of being in a teaching mode far too often. And if we're in that mode, we're not really listening. So it's important to kind of sometimes just sit and listen. And what I found with teenagers is that if you listen, you really do learn a lot. And oftentimes they can teach us things that we didn't know. It's important not to belittle or to minimize. In other words, a lot of issues that we see in a teenager's life, we as adults see as sort of trivial. For example, if a child is having a lot of anxiety or a lot of heartache over a relationship that they're worried about, we tend to see it as, oh, it's no big deal, it's just teenage crush or something like that. And that can be very invalidating. At that point in their life, these things are very important to them, so it's important that we listen without belittling or minimizing. Next, to have a relationship, anchor yourself securely and don't react to their capriciousness or their inconsistency. In other words, teenagers frequently will be on 1 minute, off 1 minute, and it's important that you are stable, okay, because adolescents tend to be unstable in many ways. And finally, communication, which is a very, very important part of a relationship. It's important that you communicate, meaning listen, talk to them, have them talk to you. Communication is all part of a relationship. Now, back to our diagram of those two domains that separate. For teenagers, you have behavior and identity. Let me tell you why it's important now to understand these two tools better. In the area of behavior, or the 3 R's, risk, responsibility, and respect, you have to be in the role of rank. In other words, when they test those limits, it's time for you to step in and be in charge. Those have to be enforced. But for the other areas of teenagers, for other areas of a teenager's life, meaning ideas, beliefs, opinions, you can't use rank, you have to use your relationship. In other words, those are things that respond to influence, not control. In the next diagram, you'll see that those tools really are not interchangeable. In other words, you cannot expect to get your teenager to respect the 3 R's by using or leveraging your relationship. And you don't want to use rank to try to control their identity. The next slide will show you what happens if you use these tools in the wrong order. Using your relationship or leveraging your relationship to try to enforce those 3 R's will result in a parent pleading with their kid or their teenager, trying to cajole them, acting like a peer, trying to use manipulation or threats or guilt. It really looks like a parent coming down to the level of a teenager and trying to talk them into responding or respecting those 3 R's or those non-negotiable rules. That just does not work at all. It's ineffective, and it really undermines your effectiveness. On the other hand, the next slide shows you what it looks like when you try to use rank to influence beliefs, opinions, and values, or what we call identity. What this looks like, it looks like oppression. The teenager feels controlled, and a lot of times what you'll see there is you'll see a lot of rebellion. They may comply externally, but internally there's a lot of resentment, defensiveness, and anger. And this is where you see those enormous power struggles that really get families into trouble. You don't want to use your authority or rank to try to control their identity. That just sets up terrible power struggles. So the main thing here is really to understand that every parent has 2 tools, but they're very, very different: rank and relationship. Use those tools in the domains that they need to be used in. In other words, rank for the 3 R's, relationship for the other areas. And one thing I should say is that as your teenager grows older and nears that period of late adolescence and budding adulthood, you really want to start relying more heavily on relationship than rank anyway. What I find in working with teens is that when they're out there, say at a party or in a situation that's difficult, what goes with them is not your rank, it's your relationship. In other words, all the teens who say to me, the reason I choose different decisions or the reason I choose not to do this or that, it's not because I'm afraid of my parents necessarily, it's because I don't want to disappoint them. The relationship goes with them to the party. The relationship goes with them on the date. So as you get older, you're seeing your job as a parent transitioning from using rank more to using relationship more. And that means maintaining relationship in their life. Now, at this point, I want to talk to you and sort of wrap up with some of the most common pitfalls that I see, or most common difficult situations that I see with teenagers and their families. And I find these to be very common, and that's why I want to talk to you about them and maybe give you some ideas. The first one is overemphasizing achievements. Now, I consult a lot to some private schools, and a lot of times the emphasis is on grades and performing and getting into a good college. And we do know now that admission into college is becoming more competitive, and so a lot of parents are anxious about their kids becoming competitive for college and making good grades, etc. I want to read a quote from you, for you from renowned psychiatrist Ed Hallowell in Boston. And I have a slide that lists this because I think it's important. And what he says is this, quote, "If you overemphasize the importance of the achievements rather than the process of getting there, you run a serious risk of turning your child into a kind of achievement junkie who has no true enthusiasm for anything except more achievement. This is not a recipe for a meaningful or happy life." I couldn't agree with that comment more, and I see that so many times when I'm working with families and teenagers. A lot of times I will see parents so focused on achievements, grades, and school performance, that every privilege a child has short of breathing is tied to how well they're doing in school. And unfortunately, if that is overemphasized, you can get in some power struggles that frankly cannot be won. There was a research study not too long ago that asked kids to respond to some questions. And I want to give you the results of that because I think it also proves that overemphasizing achievements can actually be counterproductive. And I have a slide that illustrates this. Kids were asked a certain number of questions, and what they found was that the teenagers who answered yes to the following questions actually got worse grades in school than the kids who did not. And the questions were, do you think that getting into your first choice college will make a crucial difference in your life? The other question was, do you feel that your self-esteem depends more on your grades than anything else? And the last question was, do you feel under intense pressure from your parents to do well academically? Kids who answered yes to these questions actually did worse than the kids who didn't. There was also a study by Dan Kindlin at Harvard, and what he found was that when they identify a group of kids known as underachievers, what they found was that the single biggest factor related to underachievement in kids was that their parents put intense pressure on them to perform. So actually what we found is that it was counterproductive to achievement. Now the next question I usually get is, well, then what about performance? Isn't that important? And the answer is, of course, that's one of the responsibilities. But we don't want to overemphasize achievements. And then parents always say, well, then how do I motivate my teenager? Well, let me briefly just say this. I think motivation is overrated, meaning when you focus on motivation to fulfill responsibilities, you're actually focusing on an area that you can't really control. And so what I tell parents and teenagers is this: don't depend on motivation to get the job done. Make it a responsibility issue. And in the next slide, what I tell people is it's kind of like you have a wagon that you want to go somewhere, and you can hitch it to one of two horses. If you hitch your wagon to motivation, or in other words, if you hitch your effort to your motivation, you're going to find that it's not going to go very far. Your motivation level will rise and fall, and thus your effort will rise and fall. But if you connect your effort to your responsibility levels, then your performance will be consistent and will tend to get the job done more frequently. So one of the things I really counsel parents about is don't focus so much on motivating your kids as on making them into responsible teenagers. And responsible teenagers become responsible adults. Now, the second common pitfall that I see a lot with parents is overprotecting their children. Overprotecting children means not allowing them to fall into normal consequences, not allowing them to experience normal consequences, and not allowing them to go through some of the more difficult circumstances that are inevitable. The next slide I have has a couple of quotes from Wendy Mogul, who is a well-known psychologist who wrote the book The Blessing of a Skinned Knee. And here's what she says, and I really agree. When we treat our children's lives like cruise ship directors who must get them to their destination, adulthood, smoothly, without their feeling even the slightest bump or wave, we're depriving them. Those bumps are part of God's plan. And her next quote is, this is the only way children will mature into resilient, self-reliant adults. By continuing to make miracles on demand, we are unwittingly slowing down the development of our children's inner strength. Now, I agree with her completely, and what I find is that oftentimes parents, out of a sincere motivation to protect their children, actually buffer them from experiencing some difficulties that help the kids develop resilience and develop the ability to deal with adversity. Martin Seligman, out of Pennsylvania, who wrote the book Learned Optimism, among others, says this, and I have a quote from him on the next slide. Life inflicts the same setbacks and tragedies on the optimist as on the pessimist, but the optimist weathers them better. The optimist bounces back from defeat, and with his life somewhat poorer, he picks up and starts over again. The pessimist gives up and falls into depression. Because of his resilience, the optimist achieves more at work, at school, and on the playing field. The optimist has better physical health and may even live longer. Now, Dr. Seligman has done extensive research on people who respond to adversity in ways that he calls optimistic versus pessimistic. And what he finds is that people who deal with adversity effectively have experienced it and are able to deal with it in the future. So preventing our kids from experiencing negative consequences of their actions, in other words, if they don't prepare for a test and fail, that's a negative experience. If they make a bad choice and suffer consequences, that's a learning experience. It develops resilience. Rick Warren, author of The Purpose-Driven Life, actually says this, and I have another quote in the next slide. Every problem is a character-building opportunity, and the more difficult it is, the greater the potential for building spiritual muscle and moral fiber. All of these folks that I've quoted really agree on the same thing. People have to experience some difficulty in order to develop character. And this is consistent with the Bible in James, which I have this on a slide as well, which says this, "Count it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." I think the point is clear. All of us hate to see our kids experience difficulty. However, if we overprotect them, we're robbing them from the choice and the opportunity to develop the ability to become resilient and mature and to not fear adversity in the future. Now, the third common obstacle that I see, or common pitfall that I see families falling into with teenagers, is underestimating the prevalence of substance abuse. And quickly, I want to give you some data just so you will see how prevalent this issue is. And this data is from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. The next slide you will see shows the lifetime alcohol use of high school children. And what you'll see there are numbers ranging from 73% of ninth graders up to 85% of 12th graders have tried alcohol at some point. The next slide shows that the percentage of kids in high school who are currently drinking alcohol ranges from 41% of ninth graders to 55% of 12th graders. In other words, half of the seniors are currently drinking. The next slide shows that heavy drinking, which we define as at least 5 drinks on one occasion in the last 30 days, ranges from 1 out of 4 ninth graders to about 36% of 12th graders. And these numbers seem high, but my experience is that they are not inaccurate. The next slide shows lifetime marijuana use. And what this shows is that 32% of ninth graders and up to 51% of 12th graders have tried marijuana at some point in their life. The next slide shows how many of those are continuing to smoke marijuana, from 19% of ninth graders to 26% of 12th graders. Now, use is alarming enough, but the next slide shows how many teenagers are actually driving after drinking, and that ranges from 6.6% of ninth graders to over 22% of 12th graders. And the final slide shows the number who actually ride with someone who's been drinking, and those numbers range from 30% of ninth graders to 32% of 12th graders. Now, I give you those numbers really just to help you understand the prevalence of this issue in adolescence. If you work with teenagers, or if you're a parent of a teenager, it's likely that the issue of substance use is going to come up on the radar screen at some point during this time. I have a model that helps parents understand how this develops, and I call it the 5 C's. And the next slide lists those 5 C's. What happens initially is kids learn about substance use and they become curious. In other words, they wonder what it's like, their friends talk about it, so they start developing a curiosity. After they get curious, then they decide they're going to try it, and that becomes casual. In other words, what they do next is they say, well, I think I'll try it and see what it's like. And that might be an experience with very few negative consequences, so they're more comfortable trying it maybe later on, say a month or 2 months later. And so that's what we call the casual phase. After a while, they become more comfortable using, and once they become more comfortable, then they start to get careless. And after they start to get careless, then they're bound to get caught. And what this continuum shows is that by the time a teenager gets caught using a substance, it's unlikely it is their first time. In my experience, teenagers are so paranoid the first time they try something that they very rarely get caught. But inevitably, if a teenager is caught with alcohol or a drug, their first response is, well, this is the first time I've ever tried it. And what parents should know is that's pretty unlikely. And what you need to understand is that this continuum is very insidious. My advice to families is know how you will handle it if it comes up before it comes up. In other words, have your response ready, because when families find that their teenagers have been experimenting with drugs or alcohol, they tend to panic and their response is not well thought out. It's more reactive than proactive. So if you're working with families, or if you do have a teenager in your family, think about how you want to handle that if it comes up, because according to the data I just showed you, it's very likely that it could, and it's best to be prepared. Now, finally, the last pitfall that I find parents falling into with teenagers is creating a world that orbits around their children. Now, the next slide, I'm just going to read you a quote. When children grow up in a home where the world does not revolve around them, they are much less likely of developing the type of self-centeredness that leads to maladaptive character traits. As a clinical psychologist, one of the things I can tell you is that excessive focus on oneself is a recipe for all kinds of problems later in life. Many types of eating disorders and depression actually trace back to a root of excessive focus on oneself. It's a little more complex than that, but one of the points is that when anybody is over-focused on themselves, they're really at risk for developing some pretty bad or unhealthy character traits. So creating a world that orbits around your kids actually puts them at a disadvantage. I'm going to quote again from Wendy Mogul on the next slide, who says this: "We sympathetic, fair-minded parents need to make a conscious effort to establish ourselves as the honored rulers in our homes." Really is consistent with one of God's original commands to honor your father and your mother. This also, if you think about it, traces back to that idea of respect as one of the 3 R's. I see a lot of families who they love their kids, but what they do is they put their kids sort of in the center of the world. In other words, what we find is that the kids kind of run the show. In other words, they're really orbiting around their kids' lives and activities, and the parents take a back seat to what's going on in their kids' lives. We find that this is very destructive for them. And there's a research study that goes along with this. Dan Kinlan, in the next slide, will show you the results of this. Dan Kinlan did a study, and he found that girls who admitted that they were spoiled, in other words, their parents sort of orbited around their lives, these girls were actually willing to admit that, yeah, my parents kind of indulge me and spoil me and the world kind of orbits around me, were, first of all, 3 times more likely to have driven drunk, were twice as likely to have smoked marijuana, and were at a higher risk for many other problems such as academic underachievement, bulimia, cigarette smoking, cheating on tests, and skipping school. Now that's quite a list, and a lot of these things are things parents really fear. And what we find is that kids who are overindulged or who are spoiled are actually at greater risk for developing some of these character traits. In a similar vein, we found that males or boys who admitted that they were very spoiled were at higher risk for an equal number of bad outcomes. For example, boys who admitted that they were overindulged were more at risk for lying, for cheating, for being anxious or depressed, for skipping school, for underachievement at school, for using creatine and steroids, and for drunk driving. Again, I think if you look at that list, what you will see is that these are things that all parents sort of lose sleep over at night. And the point here is this, that if parents are able to resist the urge to sort of orbit around their children's lives and to overindulge, then they're going to be less likely to contribute to some of the environmental things that contribute to these maladaptive character traits. So if we review, what I would encourage you to do is keep on the lookout for these 4 main pitfalls that parents with teenagers tend to fall into. The first one is parents who tend to overemphasize achievements or grades or performance in school. The second one is overprotecting their children. In other words, not allowing them to experience the consequences of their choices or some of the more common adverse experiences of life. And that includes things like breakups with relationships, not making the team, getting a bad grade, not preparing for a test. These are things we need to let kids experience because that's the way that they develop the ability to deal with difficulty later on. The third is the prevalence of substance abuse. It's likely that it will come up, and it's important to think about how you'll handle it beforehand. And the fourth is avoiding a world that orbits around children, because kids who tend to grow up in homes where the world orbits around them develop a sense of entitlement and a sense of overindulgence that leads to some pretty bad outcomes. Now, again, all of you who work with teenagers or work with families with teenagers, and certainly if you have a teenager in your home, let me recap a little bit of what we discussed today. First of all, adolescence is a tremendous time of transition. The transition is not just for your teenager, but it's also for parents as well. Teenagers are going from childhood to adulthood, which is an enormous transition. It's frightening, it's anxiety producing, it's challenging, and parents are going from the role of really being the manager of their kids to more of a consultant to their kids, and so they need to transition as well. If you have a teenager in a home or if you work with families with teenagers, try to condense your rules down to 3 non-negotiable rules. And my suggestion would be responsibility, risk, and respect. In other words, these 3 really should always be in place. I find that most teenagers agree that's a fair number of rules, and most of your major concerns can be covered by these 3 rules. Next, you want to make sure that you understand that parents have 2 tools at their disposal, rank and relationship. Rank is really when you need to step in and take charge. I would recommend that you use rank for the 3 R's. When your kids cross that line of respect or responsibility, or certainly if they're into risky things, step in there, take charge, use your rank. And remember, rank is used to control. You're getting control of the situation. However, the other tool, relationship, will become more important as your child becomes older. Relationship, remember, is used to influence. And what you want to use relationship for is to influence what goes on inside your teen's life. In other words, their beliefs, their identities, their values. These things are not controllable by being in charge. These things are not things you pull rank over. You don't force a child to believe a certain way or to like a certain person. You influence them. And the best way to influence them is to have a good relationship. Think about your own life for a minute. The people with whom you have the closest relationship probably have the biggest influence on your life. And certainly for your teenager, you want to be one of those people who has influence. In other words, your relationship will lead to that influence. So if you understand you can get past most of your power struggles with 3 main rules, if you understand you have 2 tools at your disposal and know when and how to use them, a lot of the power struggles that families just get locked into can really be avoided, and you can successfully transition through this difficult but necessary time of adolescence. In addition, there's certain pitfalls. Certainly there are more, but these are the 4 that I see most often that teenagers and their families encounter. And hopefully I've given you some ideas on how to help families get through some of these difficult times. I hope this has been helpful, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.